Jazz, a form of music created during the 20s, was said to be influenced by various cultures, African, European, and Latin. African influence in jazz included the call-and-response structure, which emphasizes group participation in riffs, polyrhythms, and polymeters. European influences included European harmony and compositional techniques, as well as many European instruments, such as the saxophone, trumpet, piano, etc. It is also said that jazz has a foundation in the blues and ragtime, where the blues had roots in Africa and ragtime emphasized syncopation and polyrhythms, which are both found in jazz. Most people agree that jazz originated in New Orleans because of several primary conditions: a large population of free black people, fluid cultural boundaries, active Afro-Caribbean culture, vital musical life, popularity of brass bands, and a pervasive good times mood. World War I had stalled American culture, and after the end of it, people became positive and wanted to live fast-paced and carefree lives. They were hungry for entertainment, and jazz was the answer. Jazz began to synthesize with concert music. Symphonic jazz combined concert music with jazz rhythms. This type of jazz influenced composers such as George Gershwin and Paul Whiteman. When Prohibition succeeded, it greatly impacted jazz. Prohibition was also considered feminist because many women and children who suffered from violence due to drunk men were its supporters. What supporters of the 18th Amendment hadn't expected was that the youth were more inclined to drink than they ever had before. Prohibition gave rise to a thriving illegal industry which made money from liquor sales and smuggled booze in clubs. And as more people craved alcohol in these clubs, they craved jazz entertainment as well. The most popular clubs were known as speakeasies. Speakeasies competed for popularity, and in order to bring more customers, they needed music. Not just any music, but jazz music. Jazz is credited for its impact on the culture of the Roaring Twenties due to the rebellion of the average young person against the older society. For example, while the older generation danced the waltz, young people danced the Charleston. The new dances inspired by jazz were sexually suggestive and shocked the older generation. F. Scott Fitzgerald, author of The Great Gatsby, declared the 1920s the jazz age, on account of his observations that the parties were bigger, the pace was faster, the buildings were higher, the morals looser. Jazz may have been considered feminine because of the success of singers such as Bessie Smith and Ella Fitzgerald, as well as the mass integration of women into places where jazz was played. Since women took more jobs and earned more money for themselves, they gained a new independence. The image of the flapper, which is still iconic today, became popular. Flappers had bobbed hair and wore makeup and a loose, flowy knee-length dress. Yet their style was more than just a trend, it was a social statement. Like the rest of her generation, a flapper was a young woman who wasn't afraid to push social boundaries.
So I'm what they call a flapper. I do what I want to do. I drink when I want to drink. And I party when I want to party. I don't care what the old lady said.
These flappers were single, independent women who consistently attended speakeasies and clubs. Many enjoyed the freedom of these spaces where they could dance, flirt, smoke, and drink. However, there were still limitations for women in this new culture. Although women actively participated in jazz culture as musicians and dancers, in mass culture, male musicians were given the spotlight. All-girl jazz bands were dismissed by music and culture critics. In journalism, young women were sometimes blamed for the growth of jazz culture and were depicted as fools. On the other hand, moralists blamed jazz for corruption of women. Older women were angered about the image of the modern woman and formed anti-flirt clubs to discourage flirting. In his 1931 essay, Echoes of the Jazz Age, Fitzgerald explained the evolution of the term jazz. The word jazz, in its progress towards respectability, had meant first sex, then dancing, then music. He failed to mention that its progress towards respectability had to entail its progressive whitening, its transformation from a black subcultural and subversive expression to a mainstream entertainment. Even in the comparatively cosmopolitan New York, life in the jazz age remained strict and racially segregated. In 1923, a gangster named Oni Madden opened a nightclub in Harlem called the Cotton Club. It featured black jazz musicians, black entertainers, and black staff. The Cotton Club was immensely popular, but even in African-American Harlem, it catered only to white customers. Although black musicians were given opportunities to promote their music through the radio and recording industry, they scarcely rose in social status. Popular bands were only promoted as long as there was a demand for jazz by white dancers. Because their artistic innovation was blocked by whites from becoming successful, black people were unable to progress far on political, social, and economical levels. Jazz music created a form of identity and uniqueness among African American musicians, but they were hardly credited for inventing it. Since whites did not credit African Americans for their musical talents, whites became more famous than them. Whites took all the acknowledgments, and this angered the African Americans. Thus, African Americans did not receive equal benefits. Since whites were in control of the record industry, they were basically in control of African Americans' economic success or failure. White musicians benefited from the talent of African American musicians. Whites were commonly labeled exploiters. Thus, for the financial gain they drew from the music, they were called thieves. Even though African Americans were great innovators of this genre of music, the majority of musicians experienced little success. Jazz was closely tied with the record industry. In 1921, 100 million phonographs were recorded. In the next 2 years, production continued because of the demand from dancers for jazz music. These records were used to practice dances such as the shimmy, the black bottom, the foxtrot, and the Charleston. African Americans demanded their right to perform, record, unionize fair wages, decrease segregation in theaters, and obtain respect for jazz. As a result, African American recording studios like the Black Swan Records developed. Many recording companies decided that African American musicians would be popular with the consumer market. Speakeasy owners hired local black jazz musicians, which allowed them to earn more profit. In response, police officers would fine the owners for having an unsanitary club. Another irony is that the best jazz musicians who put on the best shows were usually African Americans, yet clubs didn't allow black customers. Black musicians offered jazz, which created an irresistible atmosphere for the customers. Blacks and whites were able to mingle for the first time. Along the Mississippi River, steamboats offered dance excursions, which provided employment for many of New Orleans' jazz musicians. This activity became important for many of the city's black jazz bands. A top-performing site, the Pythian Temple Roof Garden, hired black jazz performers to play on a boat for middle and upper-class blacks, whereas the Struckfist Company hired black bands to perform for white audiences. Jazz musicians who had been earning $1.50 a night working in dance halls and saloons in the district 10 years earlier were now making $125 a night when working at these wealthy locations. From its start, jazz was linked to the civil rights movement. As Louis Armstrong's music career began in the 1920s, he silently spoke out for civil rights by using his talent and celebrity status to advertise social justice and racial equality. When criticized for not taking any public stand, Armstrong would reply, "I don't get involved in politics, I just blow my horn." Not only did artists like Louis Armstrong help to reshape popular music in America, they also helped to improve relations between black people and white people, and within the black community. They all shared the same interest: jazz. In Massachusetts, Harlem became a cultural center, but the movement wasn't just about literature, art, and music, it was a reinforcement of black pride. Black leaders believed that artistic achievement would not only improve racial relations, but help black people redefine their collective cultural identity. A prime example would be Langston Hughes, who based his poetry on jazz rhymes to emphasize his pride in being black. The merging of jazz and poetry became known as jazz poetry. It alluded to jazz and created a distinct voice for African Americans. Art Deco was a type of art in the 1920s that was minimalist and used vibrant colors as well as emphasized geometric shapes. Jazz culture, with its parties and flappers, became a popular subject in works of art, such as the works of Cole Phillips and George Barbier. Although jazz suffered from cultural criticism in the era it was born, jazz brought lasting changes to American culture. It was a new genre of music that celebrated innovation, social liberation, and feeling good. Though there were many social, political, and economic difficulties, jazz musicians were able to take the rough of the good and overcome adversity. Artists and poets were inspired by jazz and its culture. Today, jazz still transcends boundaries and encourages change. The changes that took place during the 20s formed a mark on American music and society that will never be forgotten.